Okay, this is a lecture on art from South Asia before 1300. And the first topic here is the Buddhist and Hindu works of art from ancient and what in the West we call it medieval periods, from 2000 BC all the way up to about 13 or 1400 AD. Okay, this slide is bust of a man from Indus, I-N-D-U-S, Valley. Location is Pakistan, and the date 2000 BC. This was from a civilization, this bust, slightly smaller than life size, that was the first urban civilization in the what we today would call the Indian subcontinent. Now, today those areas, or that area I should say, includes the countries of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Kathmandu. And the areas in that subcontinent at that time, we're talking about over 4,000 years ago, first flourished as an urban civilization over 2,000 years before the Common Era in what's now Pakistan. The Indus River runs through both Pakistan and India. The Indus Valley civilization was an Aryan civilization. Now today that word has come to have a very different meaning than it originally did. But the original use or definition of that term is for those cultures that sprang from that area of the South Asia or Indian subcontinent cultures. And this was an early advanced urban civilization which had an important role for their priest class. And so the bust we're looking at is of a high priest from the Indus Valley civilization, as it's called now. How do we know he's a high priest? There's no written records associated or found with it. Well, there are 3 or 4 clues. First, look at his eyes, and the overall expression is one of contemplation or meditation or even prayer, inward looking, quiet contemplative expression that would indicate a high ranking priest, perhaps in the process of meditating or praying. The second clue is the headband across his forehead. That is a definite symbol for, again, higher ranking priest members of the priest class. And then we have 2 other clues. His beard is prominently displayed or emphasized on this bust. And in almost all ancient cultures, Western or Eastern, at least certainly in the Eastern Hemisphere, we'll say, all through ancient Babylon, Egypt, Greece, the Romans, a little different, but certainly up until the Roman times, and through all the Asian cultures. The longer the beard, the wiser and more important the man was. And so this would indicate an important high-ranking person. And if those aren't enough clues, his robe have 3-leaf clovers, or has a pattern of 3-leaf clovers on it, which is itself indicative of a priest or someone in the high-ranking religious level of Indus Valley civilization. By the way, this is actually a popular symbol for a number of establishments that have roots, such as Indian and Pakistani restaurants. There's one in Berkeley you can go to once they reopen after this lockdown period we're in, called Cabana. It's on University Avenue in Berkeley, and you can tell them I sent you, if you can think of it, because the owner's a good friend of mine and my daughter. Known him since my daughter was 3 years old. Excellent food, and their menu, at least they did have, they may have changed it, but for many, many years, had a photo on the front of it of this very bust. One more thing about the Indus Valley civilization, before we do the formal analysis. This is the root, this culture was the root of almost all European language. They're called Indo-European languages. So there was migration even earlier than this, well before this, probably 4,000 or 5,000 BC, from the area of the Indian subcontinent, or South Asian cultures, Indus Valley areas, into what's now Europe, by nomadic peoples who supplanted the peoples that were there before, the prehistoric tribes, and eventually developed into the various languages that we consider European languages. The only exceptions, there are two, are Hungarian and Finnish. No one knows where those two languages came from, but linguists have traced the origins of just about all other European languages to this area of South Asia, the Indus Valley civilization. So we have common cultural origins or roots with that part of the world. Okay, formal analysis. It's balanced, of course, but you could say weighted toward the bottom because obviously his body is wider than his head. It's really only one mass, but you could break it down, I suppose, and say his torso and then his head. It's slightly smaller than life size, so it's a real three-dimensional object, but there is a technique of overlapping. The beard and the headband overlap his face, and the robe overlaps his body. Obviously, it's been damaged. You can see it's missing most of both arms. But there's plenty of rhythm with what's left of the three-leaf clover pattern, the beard, the eyes, and ears. And then we have texture. There is semi-texture on the beard, certainly, and I would say the headband and the robe. And that's done with carved line, obviously not painted line. It's a cool color in this slide, but actually having seen photos, more clear photos than this file from Stockstad allows, it actually has a kind of a warmish tone to it. So it's kind of on the cusp. So if you ever had to describe it, you could say either cool gray with a slight tint of warm or hint of warm tan, or more. If you feel more, the tan shows up more, then you could say that's veers into the warm side of the color spectrum. Okay, and then we have let's see, balanced. Yeah, I think we've covered it all. Oh, no, there's no modeling for it. Oh, and it is mostly stable. Yeah, that's always important to remember. What's stable about it? It's upright. He's looking straight at us. His head, the sides of his head are pretty straightforward. So there isn't really a lot that's dynamic, except the details, of course, on the three-leaf clovers of his robe and his jaw on the top of his head, and to some extent the ears. But overall, the shape of this bust is primarily stable. Okay. This is the Great Stupa at Sanchi, and that is S-T-U-P-A, Stupa at Sanchi, S-A-N-C-H-I, India, 250 BC. This is one of the largest and best preserved of all of the stupas in South Asia. A stupa is, there's the definition, a Buddhist house of worship with a large central dome beneath which worshippers walk in a clockwise direction around a collection of religious relics. Now, this stupa was somewhat enlarged and had gates. You can see the tall gate there, over 30 feet high, on the entrance, or at the entrance here, with lintels. Remember that word from Stonehenge, lintels across the top, 3 lintels. We'll talk about what's on those in a few minutes. Those things in the outer railing were added about 150 BC, but the original structure goes back a good 100 years before that, and it's still a functioning stupa for Buddhist faithful. These sites were meant for worshippers of Buddhist philosophy, or followers, if you prefer, believers of the Buddhist teaching, to find inspiration in their quest for enlightenment, that he advised people to follow the path to enlightenment. And since we're now talking about Buddhism, this will be the next definition. Buddhism was a religion that began in India about 500 BC, which teaches that there is an eightfold path to enlightenment that you should follow during your life. And those 5 of those paths include right speech, right thinking, right attitude, right livelihood, and right action. A way of shortening that could be do the right thing, but of course it's much more complex than that. So we don't have time to go into a detailed description of Buddha and his life, but the one thing that everyone should know, if you're interested in understanding at least the beginnings of Buddhism, is he was a prince who could have inherited his father's kingdom in a life of luxury and power. He completely rejected that as a young man and went wandering in the wilderness throughout India for several years. And one day he sat down beneath a tree. It was a special tree. I can't remember the name of that tree, but it was a magic tree. And he had, some would call it an epiphany, and others would say a moment of enlightenment, in which he realized that the root of all human suffering is desire. And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense. And that conflicting desires between human beings cause most of the suffering in the human race. So he wanted people to be able to get beyond those kinds of conflicting desires and achieve what he called total enlightenment during their lifetime, if they followed his teachings in the Eightfold Path, and 5 of those are the ones I just gave you, are the most important ones. So you could perhaps go inside a stupa like this one and get closer to becoming enlightened by contemplating the meaning of your life, or how you're behaving, or what you're doing right or wrong in your life, and whether you're following Buddha's teachings correctly or not. So relics from his life in the original stupas, they were built within a few decades after he died. The oldest ones, I believe this included, actually had small pieces of objects of some kind associated with his life that were on display in the reliquary in the center of these domes. Okay, but the gates here have carved figures that are relating to the events, some of the major events in the life of Buddha. We'll talk about those when we take a close-up. But first, let's do a formal analysis, because the close-ups, you're going to see the next 2 slides are details of this stupa, and those won't, of course, give you a full view. So let's do the formal analysis now. It's completely balanced, absolutely, totally symmetrical left to right, and of course it widens out at the bottom, so it's unbalanced toward the bottom. It's warm earth tones. I mean, there is packed earth literally on top of stones, and then that was covered with plaster originally, and that would have been painted a bright color, white probably, but this is how it looks now. And then the railings around the outer edge, and at the base of the dome, and at the very top you see there with the finial pointing towards not heaven but towards enlightenment, with the 3 discs. You can just see it there at the very top of the dome inside its own square railings. Those all have warm earth tones, various shades of tan and yellow stone colors. Okay, and then we have the rhythm. Obviously the railings create rhythm, the lintels and the gates themselves, and the blocks of rows of stones on the dome. It is dynamic, almost entirely on the dome. It's totally dynamic. The railing, well, some individual segments of the railing, the upright portions, are stable, but the railings are round, and so they're more dynamic than stable, and the gateways are both, because the actual structures, as you can see with the upright post and cross lintels, that's stable, but the figures on them are mostly dynamic. There is some simulated texture done with carved line only on the gates. Otherwise, it's the real textures of rough stone, rough earth, right? And the materials that you see there are all real on the dome itself and on the railings. So it's smooth on the outer railing, and the one at the base of the dome, real textures, and then everything else is rough textures. Okay, and then we have this modeling. Of course, that's from the sun creating shadows on the figures that are carved on the gateways. And then we have, for space, it's one large open dome space with about a 60-foot high ceiling at the center of the dome. It's real space. And there is, of course, on the carved figures of the lintels, some overlapping of figures. Okay. Okay, this is a detail of one of the posts, the upright post on the gates below the lintels at the entrance to the great stupa of Sanchi that we just discussed. And some of the details here are scenes from the life of Buddha, including even some from his father, who was a great king, a warrior king, who had conquered large sections. Actually, most of India was under his rule by the time his son came of age and chose not to inherit his father's kingdom and instead seek enlightenment. So these are figures dressed in the attire and armor and so forth of the warriors and also of the population or citizens of India at this time, at the time of Buddha's early years, which would be about 5 centuries BC. And so you can see that these have rhythm, and then there are animals that are ubiquitous. Of course, elephants, sometimes used in combat in India. In fact, Alexander the Great adopted the use of elephants in combat when he was conquering 3 continents after, of course, the Golden Age of Athens, and he became the ruler of then the greatest empire in the Western world before the Romans. He used elephants in combat, which he learned from fighting various armies in what's now Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. You see them there near the top. And then the figures just cut off, I'm not sure why the slide does that, but would be people dressed in, you can't see their heads, but you can see the robes of the figures across the top part of this slide, in the attire that some Buddhist priests or monks might have worn at this time. Because by the time this was done, this lintel, it was over 3 centuries after the death of Buddha. He lived to be about 80 years old, had a nice long life, and spread the word of Buddhism throughout, again, what's now pretty much all of India and Pakistan, and even what today is a separate country, Sri Lanka, before he died. And ironically, Buddhism is not very doesn't have very many adherents in its birthplace. There aren't many Buddhists in India. There are actually more Christians in India than there are Buddhists, from what I've read, but those are both minority religions. And of course there are tens of millions of Muslims in India, but the vast majority, about 85% of India, are Hindus, which we will describe the meaning of that in a moment. Okay, next slide will be another detail, and we'll get to that. Okay, this is a detail, a very individualized detail of a single female deity or sacred figure from one of the lintels. Actually, it's on the outer edge or corner of one of the lintels at the main gate to the great stupa of Sanchi that we've been talking about. And she has symbolic meaning. It's a combination of fertility, both human fertility and general fertility of the land and of the crops and things. For instance, some people think above her head are bananas. First glance, they do kind of look like, or plantains or some other kind of tropical fruit. But certainly there are fruits at some point around her head, but the curved lines, according to most art historians, represent leaves from just a general tree type of, a large tree, flowering, planting, fruit ripening tree. And her body emphasizes various obvious reproductive aspects of female anatomy, but she's also posed in a very, we could say, charming is what Stockstead calls it. I think that's as good a word as any. Posed with one leg crossed behind her other leg, and her arms reaching out to support herself against the tree she is sheltered by. This is from that period, 2,200 years ago, where the gate was done around 150 BC, in which the golden age of Indian, as in Buddhist, stupa, or other religious sites in India. The art in India had reached a high point in depicting human, I should say, anatomy, human details of the human figure, and expressions. You see her face; she looks very self-assured and aware of her importance as a minor deity and a source of fertility, both human and plant fertility. And so this is an example of how the early Buddhist stupa stone carvers and artists in general were creating very highly realistic and detailed figures, both human and animal figures, for the art on both stupas and in other sites throughout India. This is an 11-foot high carving inside a cave, the cave of Shiva, a religious site deep within, carved into the side of a mountain in India. And the title is Eternal Shiva, S-H-I-V-A, from Cave Temple, India, circa, meaning we don't have the exact year, circa 500 BC. Shiva was the most powerful of Hindu deities, so let's now give you a definition of Hinduism. It's a religion that originated in India about 2000 BC or BCE, which believes in a multitude of deities that can transform themselves from a spiritual state into a gross body state, meaning they can be just in the universe, in the cosmos, as a spiritual presence with no solid form, or at will they can come down to earth and change themselves into solid bodies or solid forms that humans can perceive. Okay, so this Shiva, this 11-foot tall carved image of her, is originally meant to imply that Shiva has 5 heads. We only see 3 here, but there would have been one in the back implied, at least. You wouldn't be able to see it. It's up against the back wall of the south side of this cave temple. And then implied and not shown would be one at the top. And why 5 heads? Because Shiva had a 5-fold nature. And these are those qualities as a, quote, creator, a protector, a destroyer, an obscurer, and a releaser. And the expression now you see on the face of Shiva shows, now it can say he, she, because it's neither male nor female, so today many people might say they, is lost deep in introspection, and the expression of the large eyes and the protruding lower lip suggests the serious nature or depths of contemplation in which Shiva is now engaging as you look at his, her, or their face. Okay? Now, over the left shoulder, the protector nature or female aspect of Shiva is depicted with a pearl festoon crown, and on the right shoulder, the wrathful destroyer nature of Shiva is depicted with a fierce expression. And so these objects or items, large monumental sculptures, were very popular, well, let's say commonly created in monumental scale of 10 or more feet tall. Often in cave temples. Of course, it was always cooler inside a cave temple for worshippers to come visit and contemplate, pray, or meditate than outside, where obviously outdoors in India most of the year is quite hot, but also protected the temples, and they were maintained by priests, of course. And these are now found all over India. Okay, so let's do a formal analysis. It's balanced. what you see is just the three heads, but obviously, oh, by the way, there's a crown on top, a very ornate, tall crown, which Shiva's powerful head and neck and shoulders are strong enough to support, well, three heads, actually five if you count the way they believed this figure would be. But you can see three heads, and they would weigh quite a bit. So it's a very powerful image, strong, muscular image of this god. Or deity. And then we have carved line, of course, creating the details on the crown and the hair and the necklaces and the faces. And that has simulated texture, of course. It's a cool grayish color, at least in this photo of the stone. The modeling would just be from torches that would have been lit to light these figures up. Obviously, underground there would be no sunlight, so there's no technique for modeling. For space, we already mentioned it's a real three-dimensional object of 11 feet in height. And then there's the overlapping of the crown and the jewels over the head and neck of these three visible heads of Shiva. And the rhythm is obvious with the eyes, the mouths, the necklaces, and ornaments in the crowns of all three heads. And for mass, we have just really one large mass, but you could break it down and say that the forward-looking head and shoulders are the largest mass, and then the equal size pretty much visible in the two heads on either right and left shoulders. But it's really a single mass. And it is both stable and dynamic, upright and stable, and the way the body is positioned, the upper body and the head and neck and even the headdress. The two side heads, the heads on either shoulder, do have some more dynamic quality in that they're slightly tilted. And of course the tops of all three have curved lines, making them dynamic. Okay. This is a standing Buddha from Sarnath, Sarnath, India, 474 AD. So we talked about who Buddha was already, but we didn't discuss some of the details about that are known about him. He was, by the time he died, famous enough throughout South Asia to have had several images of him carved, mostly, of course. That's what we would have left over from his life, from the time he was alive, and so we have some idea of what he looked like. This would indicate a period of probably 1,000, almost 900 or so years after he died. So this isn't necessarily an accurate representation of him in every detail, but it captures probably the essence of what he looked like as a young man. Tall, thin, fit, with a contemplative, you see on his face, a contemplative expression. He's inward looking, his eyes are closed, he's in meditation or contemplation, thinking about, of course, the great questions of the meaning of life and death and what happens after we die and how to achieve enlightenment. His hairdo and the long, what look like earrings below his earlobes are classic features that have always been associated with Buddha that probably are accurate details. Behind his head, what looks like a broken plate is what's left over of what originally was a halo, much like we think of with Christian saints having halos. Images of Buddha often depicted him with some kind of light of enlightenment coming from within him, and so they're depicted usually in both two-dimensional art, paintings and drawings, and sculpture as an actual like an aura or halo that got broken over the centuries. Now you can see his physique. Obviously it's meant to show off how fit he was, and of course prominent aspects of his physique are visible all the way from his shoulders down to his feet. The robes he's wearing just come up to his, or down, I should say, to his ankles. But the most important detail, I think, here, besides his expression of contemplative introspection on his face, is the raised right hand. Now, in Western culture, that usually implies someone saying, "Stop, don't come any closer." And we know what that's like in this day and age that we're living through. But that goes back thousands of years. But it's just the opposite with Buddhist images, especially ones of Buddha. He's welcoming people, those who want to become enlightened, I should say, and learn about the path to enlightenment, to come join him and listen to what he had to say. He traveled throughout India, mostly on foot, and was greeted by large numbers of people, depending on where he was at the time. Even in small villages, people would hear he was coming or hear he had just arrived and come to hear him speak. So this is a very classic pose of the type that we think is probably as close as any that have been created of him in three-dimensional sculptural images of how he might have looked, although not exactly his facial features. Now, many people know, if they've been to, even gift shops in Grand Avenue, Chinatown, or other parts of the world, gift shops selling seated Buddhas, where he's heavy-set, smiling, kind of jolly, and his eyes are open. That's a very late adaptation, and I don't even know the details as to why there was an alteration in some artistic traditions of Buddhist artists to make Buddha seem very different than he does here. But this is probably much closer to what he really would have looked like, at least in a general way, during his lifetime. By the way, if you go to the Asian Art Museum, once it reopens, and it will, it's one of the best museums in the Bay Area, you can see a room full of standing Buddhas. They're mostly standing from this same period, which again, by this time, we're looking at Buddhism having spread throughout much of Asia, not just South Asia, but into Southeast Asia and into China by this time, and even was making inroads, I guess, certainly around this time in Korea and Japan, where it then, of course, ended up becoming the dominant religion, and ironically, within a few centuries, was eclipsed and then almost replaced by Hinduism within its birthplace of India. Excuse me. So, let's talk about the former elements. It's a cool gray stone color. There's really good texture here on the hair, the face, and the robes, and that's all done with carved line. It's completely stable, except it would have been dynamic with the halo if it was intact. The top of his head, of course, but really it's almost all straight and upright. It's balanced, as human figures, intact, standing upright would be. The rhythm of the hands, the legs, the face, the eyes and lips and ears is obvious. The feet. It's hard to say it's several masses, but if you broke it down, he'd be the largest, and then if the halo was there complete or intact, it would be second largest, and then the base. There's no technique for modeling, just the lighting from the museum that is displaying this figure. For space, it's a life-size figure, roughly 6 feet tall. That's what most records indicate he probably was about that height, which is unusually tall at that time for males. But about 6 feet, and overlapping is the only technique for space, with his robes, what there are of the translucent robes you can see through, overlap his body, especially at the ankles, and his hair overlaps his head. And of course his body overlaps what portion is left of the halo behind him. Okay, that's it. This next slide is Kandariya Mahadeva Temple. I'll spell those first two words, Kandariya. Second word, Mahadeva, Mahadeva, Temple, India, circa 1000 AD. Just a quick note, we're going to skip, as you may have noticed, I did skip the reclining Buddha from Sri Lanka. We have quite a few images of Buddhist art, and of course I'm trying to keep these lectures to a manageable length of time for transferring them, into a video format for you to be able to look at, and also not take up too much of your time for those who are following these lectures. I was going to cut that slide from the class syllabus anyway. Okay, so back to this slide. This is during the golden age of temple building in northern. It's called the northern style temple building. And this is a Hindu temple. And it's what historians today we use the word medieval now. Most people associate that word only with the history of Europe during the Middle Ages, but it's a convenient term to place it in time, temporally. There's the early medieval, mid-medieval, and late medieval eras in non-Western cultures, often referring to the same period of time that covered that 1,000-year period in Europe, what we call the Middle Ages. But this was not an era of ignorance and well, there was violence, of course there was fighting, there always has been, but at this point this was a golden age of temple building. The temples, the Hindu temples like this one, got to be larger in interior space, taller. You can see this is well over 100 feet, the tallest part of it, and more ornate than they had been in the early medieval period. And so this temple has 3 chambers leading up to the main reliquary area in the front. So in that sense, it's very different than a stupa, but the central area below the tallest tower, or some call these towers almost as though they were elongated or pulled upward domes, and they do have that aspect. But we'll just say towers. The tower, the tallest one at the far left here, is well over 100 feet, 110 or more feet, to the top of the finial. You see each of the towers had a finial. One of them appears to be missing, the second one from the right. And then there's a lion-like creature, or it could even be a horse. It's hard to tell from here. Perhaps it was a horse, just below the tallest tower, as yet another kind of finial. But the Hindu priests would maintain this, and they still do, maintain this temple. And each of the 3 chambers to the right of the tallest tower were ceremonial or ritual spaces for religious rituals such as dancing, singing, playing musical instruments, praying, or contemplating, in a quiet contemplative state of mind, and also for religious offerings to the gods. Now, the whole structure in all the temples from this period in Hindu period in mid-medieval Indian architecture were built on a platform, a raised stone platform of 10 or 15 feet above the ground, to symbolize the separation of the temple, which is a sacred space, from the mundane or profane real world around it. Now, on those platforms, you can't see it here, the priest would have created mandalas. Now, that's another definition, not to be confused with the man who helped liberate South Africa from apartheid and became the first president, not Nelson Mandela, but mandala, M-A-N-D-A-L-A. That's a diagram of the cosmos created usually either inside or just outside a Hindu or Buddhist, could be either, temple with objects from the earth, such as sticks, stones, sand, and dirt. And these would have been large, several feet across, and they would have been then redone or reformed in different patterns by the priest, every several days, every week or so, maybe every few weeks. So there would have been at least one, probably several mandalas on that platform. You can just barely see the bottom of it here in this photo. So that's the main part of the meaning, and so let's do a formal analysis. We'll start with what I've said about real space. Each of these towers, or elongated domes, if you prefer to call them that, the 4 of them, obviously are taller than the one next to it, or to the right of it. But just remembering the height of the main one is enough. It's over 100 feet, about 110 feet. And then the religious ritual chambers, the 4 of them now, including the one below the main tower, are fairly tall ceilings, because, of course, when you enter up the raised staircase, you can't see in this photo, off of the right end of the temple, you would be entering where your head would be several feet below, or at least right about the height of the railings. So these are about 10 or 12 feet high, the ceilings inside each of these chambers. Then we have the rhythms. Oh, powerful, of course. This is part of the meaning now overlapping here with the formal elements. The construction method here is the oldest known to the human race. It's been used since at least the time of Stonehenge. We already discussed that before the midterm. Post and lintel. The posts or the uprights, which you see on the corners of each of these ritual chambers, and they support the lintels that, are the horizontal projecting sections of stone. And then inside on the ceiling, you'd see more of the same, supporting the weight of these massive, but they are hollow now, towers that you could look up into. So if you count that part of the space, the post and lintel technique allows for elongated, towers or domes, which rise several tens of feet, depending on which one you're standing beneath, including the tallest one, which would rise to over 100 feet. Or at least close to 100 feet, because, of course, the floors are going to be several feet above the base. Okay, and it's a kind of a warm color of almost a brown, tannish type color in the real actual structure, but here it looks almost pinkish. But the actual color, if you notice, if inside this or on the photo in Stockstead, is actually kind of a yellowish sand color. And it's real texture of rough stone, and then simulated textures are not visible in this photo, but they are there on some of the carved figures. I think you can see them between the corners of the projecting ritual chambers, in between each of the sections there, projecting outward on the recessed portion of the wall. Those are carved, of course, with simulated textures, all done with carved line. And then the largest mass, if you break it down, would be, of course, the tallest tower to the far left in this picture, and then the middle tower, one of the middle towers, the one right next to it, and of course the two remaining ones. But some would break it down differently and say the base below each of the floors on each of these ritual chambers is the largest mass. Maybe the base, you can't see it in this photo, but certainly that part visible here, that could be considered the largest mass, then the tower, the tallest tower to the right, and so forth. The modeling is just the shadows from the sun. Of course, there's no technique for modeling. It is dynamic and stable. Stable on the corners and edges of the walls below the towers and on the post and lintels of each chamber. Dynamic in every way above those, on the elongated domes or towers above the ritual spaces. Those are all dynamic. And it is balanced left to right, were you to stand in front of the staircase as you were about to enter on the far right of the photo. It would look completely balanced left to right, but of course it's completely unbalanced, totally unbalanced toward the bottom, however you look at it. Let's see, I think that's it. Yep. This slide is Descent of the Ganges, and this is also from India, 674 AD or CE. This is one of the few works for which you have the exact date, although I hesitate to say of completion because it was never totally completed, and you can see that from the lower left corner. Descent, of course, that is Descent, meaning to go down, and Ganges is capital G-A and G-E-S. As many of you already know, the Ganges is, well, I don't know if it's the largest river in India, that's probably the Indus, but in any case, it's one of the largest rivers in the Indian subcontinent, and it's the holiest river. It's a pilgrimage rite, if you will, rite as in R-I-T-E, or task that all truly devout Hindus are supposed to undertake at once in their lifetime, even if they don't live anywhere near the Ganges itself in India. They're supposed to make a trip to the, well, I guess it'd be the headwaters of the Ganges and go down or, float along it, of course, on a boat, a canoe, or something, for several days or for a length of time, and that would help in their quest for spiritual enlightenment and understanding, contemplative state of mind, understanding the meaning and purpose of life, and being able to commune with the various Hindu deities. Now, this is one of those rock cut, as the word we've used that before now, right? For any kind of sculpture that is high relief, cut out of a flat or nearly, flat stone wall or cliff. This is out of a cliff just above the Ganges proper, and it has several sacred images in it. For instance, the elephants, which are important creatures, of course they still are in India, and they are a family of the bull elephant and the mother elephant, and at least one, looks like two babies, are depicted here between the elephant's parents' legs. Then we have the Ganges itself is symbolized by the cleft in the rock that goes top to bottom, up and down. But to the left of that is a temple which, as you can look carefully, it has a stupa-like roof. Now, the word stupa has come to be modified to apply now in architecture that revives or continues this tradition of Hindu and or Buddhist temple architecture. You see it in a lot of buildings in the United States that are from the late Victorian or well into the early 20th century. Various types of revival styles for various public buildings, as well as some modern Hindu temples and or Buddhist temples. So the term has come to be more than just the original definition of a Buddhist house of worship. It can also be applied to Hindu houses of worship now, but it wasn't originally. So you see, this is now, we're getting into the early medieval period of Hindu art in India. By the time this would have been created, Hindu religion had become dominant in India, and Buddhism was, well, on the wane, although still present, but it wasn't a majority of population, was now not in India proper. What is India today was not anymore Buddhist, but was much more inclined, a higher percentage of them, to worship the deities of Hindu religion, which was, of course, much older. And you see that in this stupa. There's a figure inside, but it's the kneeling priests and worshippers outside the stupa with this small dome there, and a figure just inside the doorway. That indicate the importance of shrines or temples to Hindu deities at this point in time. And then we have Shiva is present here, but it's hard to pick her out in the different, or him, they, in the different images. But in several places there are the multi-headed, multi-armed figures. And then there's another deity that has the almost like a cobra-like back or backing, and that's the one with the snake-like body at the top of the cleft there, or near the top of it, and almost looks like a cobra's head behind the head here. Those are different varieties of deities. That's what all these figures are, from the multitude of deities that Hindus worship. But my favorite detail is the cat just below the elephant's tusk. If you look closer, you can see he's doing a dance with his arms raised up around his head and enticing mice. If you look carefully, there are a bunch of mice jumping into the water. Of course, they're going to die. They're going to drown. So it's almost like they're giving the artist here kind of a respect, if you want to say, appreciation, a gesture of appreciation to how cats help get rid of mice, which, of course, without knowing the science, I understood mice carry disease. And, obviously, ridding crowded towns and cities in Europe or Asia at that time of plagues of rats and things, or of rats, would help reduce the risk of plague. But it's a humorous image. It's almost like the cat's acting like a Pied Piper here, leading or enticing the mice to their death. Excuse me. And then for some reason, we don't know why, it could have been a sudden drought, it could have been crop failures, it could even have been a plague of some kind, and a manpower shortage of stone carvers. This was never quite finished. You can see that on the far lower left side of the slide. Okay, formal analysis. Well, because it's not completed, it feels unbalanced toward the right half, which actually in this photo is larger. But if you were to see the whole view, I've seen other photos of it. It is balanced left to right in terms of the total area covered by the two halves of the cliff, with the cleft down the middle. But because there are more obvious figures, and the elephants are particularly heavy, you would have to say it feels or looks, at least in this view, like it's unbalanced toward the right. The largest mass, easy, the bull elephant, then the mother elephant, and then probably the stupa, with the worshippers around it just to the left of the crevice. The rhythm is very obvious. The elephant's bodies, arms, legs, I meant to say, sorry. Legs, heads, ears, and then, of course, all of the various deities dancing and performing rituals, as well as some of the worshippers outside, the bodies of the worshippers outside the stupa, all create powerful rhythm. And these figures are mostly dynamic because they're all in motion. The elephants are sort of balance between dynamic details on their heads, their ears, their trunks, but the bodies are more stable of the two large elephants, the mother and father elephant. But most everything else, and the stupa, of course, is stable. Most everything else is dynamic. Here we have the shadows, which are part of the composition, because you couldn't see them without that. The modeling from the sun creates the shadows. Carved line is used to create all the figures and their simulated texture on all the bodies of both the human and divine or godlike creatures, as well as the elephants, and also the rough texture of the stone itself. The actual original color of this is a sand color. In fact, it may even be sandstone. I'm not sure. But in any case, this is not cool. The colors are not cool. They are warm earth tones, or it is one warm earth tone, sort of sand colored. And then let's see, balance. Well, I already mentioned balance. Rhythm. Oh, for space, we have overlapping, of course, of the elephants against the background, and some of the deities against the each other in some cases, as well as with the stupa overlapping the wall. The real space of this is about 30 feet high, roughly, and about 90 feet across if you were to see the whole thing in one photo. Okay. This last slide is Shiva from Tamil Nadu, and you probably remember Shiva is Shiva from Tamil Nadu, section of India, Tamil, second word capital Nadu, India, circa 1100 AD. This particular figure is a very elegant, I think is the right word, refined, perhaps you could say, image of, as we discussed who Shiva was, one of the most, if not the most powerful deity in the Hindu religion, had certainly the broadest set of powers. And it's bronze, and it's 2.5 feet tall. And the time frame we would call this is from the year. Remember, we use the references that are used throughout the world, different world cultures, as a common reference point. This would be considered mid to late or early late medieval. A period of great, I mentioned earlier, right, skill in the carving of figures of different images of Hindu deities. So here we have more clearly visible attributes of Shiva's powers. And again, we can see here, is this male or female? Neither or both. Or again, we could just say they, right? It's not meant to be clearly one or any one gender, because Shiva encompasses aspects of both male and female human qualities. But its divine qualities are what's emphasized here. Now here you don't see the other four heads. Perhaps if you walked around behind it, you would see a head on the back side. But remember, Shiva, according to Hindu tradition, had 5 heads, and already discussed that. So we'll just say here they simplify it. So what you see are the divine energy, or rays of divine energy, coming out from the side of Shiva's head, and the tall crown the heavy ornate crown above Shiva's head. I'm going to say she because this incarnation certainly has somewhat of a female quality. So here we see that she has 4 arms. That's the way Shiva is usually depicted here, almost always, and is balancing in a dance-like pose, which is symbolic of the balance that Shiva has both over various aspects of the universe and creation, with Shiva's various powers, and also the balance in the universe between opposites, yin and yang, good and evil, life and death, creation and destruction, male and female, and so forth. Various balancing acts, quite literally, of those forces in the universe are what Shiva has power over. So the flames, those are supposed to be flames on the outer edge of the circle there, are symbolic of Shiva's power over the forces of destruction in the universe. And then Shiva's dance pose, right? And in one hand, the small drum that's held. I think you can see it in the hand on the right side, and then the one arm that's pointing, or hand pointing down towards Shiva's feet, and the balancing of Shiva's legs. Those are symbolic of Shiva's powers of creation, or over the forces of creation in the universe. And then the final symbol here that's really very powerful is that Shiva is standing on the back of a midget, which would be symbolic of the forces of evil in Hindu religion. And that means Shiva has control over the powers of evil and can make sure that good dominates over evil in the universe. And so this is today other cultures would call votive object, an object you could then pray to or meditate in front of or contemplate various important questions of life and death and meaning. And when you had moments of, trials and tribulations like we're dealing with now, you might come to this object either in a temple, is probably where it was created for, a display in a temple, or perhaps some people, certainly those who had the wherewithal, the financial ability to hire someone to create one of these figures for themselves and their family, could have it in their home. But where you can see a lot of these wonderfully preserved and in varieties of sizes, and almost all in bronze actually, is at the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. Once it opens again, I think you'll want to go see that if you're interested in this type of art and the meaning of some of the details. There's more detail provided, of course, in their headset, guided audio tours, and also in some of the notes on the walls. Okay, formal analysis, and we'll wrap it up. Balanced, I would say so, but if you look carefully, one leg, of course, is crossed over. Well, both legs are slightly to the left side, on our left. So you could say there's more negative or open space on the right. If you feel that makes it weighted or unbalanced toward the left, I wouldn't argue with that, but it just has a feeling of being balanced, and it's supposed to evoke a sense of balance. So I think it has a roughly balanced feel, left to right, and perhaps top to bottom, but of course there is the extra area covered by the rays of divine energy coming out of Shiva's head, and that would imply that it's weighted or unbalanced toward the top. The rhythm is obvious. The arms, multiple arms, legs, feet, hands, and the flames around the circle. It's a cool color. Bronze is turned kind of a deep bluish green, I guess, with the patina of age. It's definitely not a warm color. There's the simulated texture of the face and hands, arms, even the flames around the outer circle. The headdress, all done with carved line. There's no technique for modeling. It's just the shadows from the museum, the lighting of the museum. Largest mass, easy, Shiva. And then probably the Ring of Fire, and then I would say it's you could say base, if you include the little midget at the bottom. That would all be one mass. It would be the third largest. Or, in other words, if you break it down, the fourth largest mass would be the midget. or perhaps the rays of divine energy behind her head if you count them as a single mass. And then we have, is it stable or dynamic? Well, I don't see anything stable at all about this except the base. The actual details of the body of Shiva and everything else around she or they, all around Shiva, every object is diagonal or curved line, so it's mostly dynamic. Okay, and then you do have the real texture of the smooth bronze. And then finally for space, the only technique, well, it's a real space. It's 32 inches high from the base to the top of the ring of fire. And you do see overlapping, of course, of her parts, body parts, arms and legs over other parts of her body. And the crown over her head. Okay, that's it.